Returning to the MRC, one of the incidents which I've heard many different accounts of is the mode of leaving of Fred Sanger after when he reached retirement age. I wondered if you had any memories of that event.
I have my own memory. I hope it's reasonably correct. And the occasion was that when Fred reached the time of his technical retirement on a Friday afternoon, a note came round saying there will be tea in the canteen 4 o'clock to mark Fred's retirement. So we were there in the canteen and Fred wasn't there. So we said, well, where's Fred? So someone said, oh, let's go and get him from his lab. So I went up to his lab and there was Fred with his pipetteman sitting at his desk, petting something into the Eppendorf tube, and someone said, Fred, it's your tea. So Fred, in his usual way, said, what's that? And they said, but Fred, it's your leaving party, it's your tea time. So Fred said, oh, put his pipetteman down, his tube, went to tea, and went home afterwards. And that was the end.
To his famous garden. Tell me something about the transition from the MRC to the university proper.
So, as it were, out of the blue, I got this letter from the Vice-Chancellor saying that they would like to ask if I would accept the John Humphrey Plummer Professorship of whatever it was, previously held by Alan Hodgkin. And so I went to Max, as I usually do. Max,
and when was this? What
this
year?
would have been in 1980-ish, maybe 1982-ish or something like that.
Yeah.
The sort of natural inclination was, well, why do you give up an excellent job in a famous lab like MRC to take on teaching and administration? So I said to Max, I've had this offer. He said, oh, I wouldn't accept that for a moment. You'll never do any science anymore, and all you do is sit on committees and waste your time on trivia. But then I discovered that a very close colleague of mine called Ron Lasky, was an early graduate student, and I've worked with him on and off all my life, a wonderful colleague, but he'd also been offered a job. This was in zoology, another professorship. So I said to Ron, well, presumably you're not going to accept yours, are you? And Ron said, well, let's just think about it. And we did think about it, and we noted that the positions that we'd inherited with the MRC unit that I came to the molecular biology lab with had essentially been whittled away, understandably, because no one else had positions. So we hadn't any staff positions anymore. So we said, well, if we could move into zoology and get a reasonable sized research grant, this would actually help a great deal. So we collectively decided, Ron Lasky and I decided we would move, and then we said, you must give us time to try and get some funding, a research grant from the cancer campaign as it was, and in course of time we did. And that turned out all to be due to Gabriel Horn. All of this home manoeuvre was I only discovered that later, entirely due to him, and a very clever manoeuvre by which he invited both of us to move into his department and gave us a floor in there, and we got the money and we moved in, and that was a very key event, because that meant we started with a sort of medium-sized research group in the department, and we did our teaching, and that was very nice, a lovely department under Gabriel. And then what happened was the work went rather well, and the cancer campaign, who sponsored us at that time, said, would you be interested in expanding a bit? So we said, well, that would be, says Ron Lasky and I said, well, it would be nice. In an ideal world, we'd have a small institute. And they said, well, tell us about that. So we went along, and they said, well, what you're asking for is more than we can possibly, but we can't produce that much money. But we could give you, we could make a contribution to such a thing. And by good fortune, the Wellcome Trust came into money at that time. And we had an approach from them saying, would you be interested in having some Wellcome support? So we said, could we put the two together? And so we did. We got funding from the Wellcome Trust and the Cancer Campaign, and I most particularly emphasise the pivotal role that Gabriel Horn played in this, because we had this offer of money. Well, it wasn't a huge amount, it was enough to build a small institute, and many of what I call the barons would have been hostile to this, but well, why should you have a new kind of thing developing in the middle when everything was going on perfectly well as it was? But the Gabriel Horn was crucial in facilitating this. He actually thought it was a good idea and helped it along, and had a word with the chief secretary of the university, Ken Edwards, what are they technically called? Something or
Secretary General.
Secretary General, who then had no doubt, due to Gabriel's advice, then said, well, what we will do is we'll first ask the General Board whether this is a good idea. The General Board said, yes, we should accept this money, this is a good idea. And then they said, well, then we'll go down to the next one. And then we'll finally go to the heads of department, with all this information behind us. And that is really how it survived. So we got the money for our first edition of this institute. And Gabriel was the chairman of our advisory board, and immensely valuable. I mean, without him, I don't think it would ever have come into existence. So I really do want to emphasize that remarkable, very good of him, because it wasn't obviously helping his department. We are associated with zoology, but it wasn't going to immediately do a lot for it. But he could see the value of this from the university's point of view, and therefore very strongly supported it with some very clever manoeuvres to get rid of the objections. And then, of course, at time, that went well, and we had an opportunity of bidding for a bigger operation, more money, and that time we got 4 million, and then we put together a proposal for this building, which would actually cost 23 million, and amazingly got that. So going back, this really means that Gabriel Horn, having given the job to Ron Lasky and myself as 2 little groups, ended up becoming this fairly substantial sized institute. We're over 200 people now here, and bring in quite a lot of money for the university. So it was an interesting piece of history, against the advice of Max Perutz, who nevertheless remained a very good friend for all of his time, even though he wasn't in his institute anymore. But it does show what someone like Gabriel can do. It really does.
Tell me a little more about Gabriel. I mean, I know him well, and like him very much.
So do I.
And he lives in the same village and so on.
You live there too, in
road. What sort of person? You must have got to know him a bit.
I do feel I know him very well. Yes. Well, immense admiration for him, and not only that, but he's such a nice and interesting person, amazingly interesting in every possible way. And he really transformed that zoology department. You know, when he took it over, it was pretty bottom of the range. By the time he'd finished, I think he had 14 FRSs in his department. Quite amazing. And then he was a highly successful master of Sydney Sussex, in my view. So he's a kind of genius at managing things and people. And he's done this other thing, coke pop they call it, which is a very clever move. And
what was this other thing?
well, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's a way of getting scientists together to advise the government. He must have talked about that anyway.
Yes, he did.
Sure he did.
He got Richard Friend and people like this to go and talk.
That's right. Yes. And
did he get you to go?
Yes. I went along and participated in one of these, but it was a very clever manoeuvre to get the government to be interested in science, and that's a huge contribution. So he's a great person, really is.
And you must have known Prill, or you must know Prill as well.
Yes.
Priscilla.
Yes.
His charming wife.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I know her too.
Yeah.
I always tease her because she has this lovely picture in zoology of monkeys jumping from one tree to another. And I said to Prill, I didn't know monkeys always jump trees in groups of 5. She said, no, there's one monkey. I said, Prill, I can count to 5. There are 5 monkeys. And this is a sort of joke. She meant to show that the one monkey in different 5 phases of its jump. But me, being an ordinary person, can count to see there are 5 monkeys. So it's quite amusing.
That's sweet. Returning again to Magdalene, it's not an easy thing to be a master of a Cambridge college, because you have a lot of responsibility, or a certain amount of responsibility, and not very much power. Did you enjoy doing it?
Yes, I was very privileged and enormously lucky, I have to say, to end up with Magdalene. Up in Magdalene. I was interviewed, I should say, by a couple of other colleges, and in retrospect, thank heavens that didn't work. I wasn't chosen, thank heavens. But Magdalene was a wonderful college to belong to, fairly small, with a very highly experienced bursar who knew everybody, and I think the way things happened was that I joined there and very much wanted to sort of feel the way. Some people, as you well know, come into a college, particularly from the outside world, and say, I must shake up this sleepy old place, they need to live in a real world, we'll get some things moving. Well, I didn't do that at all. And then the advice I was given, if you really want something to happen, you don't suggest it at all. You find someone else who suggests it to someone else, and gradually a sort of feeling comes up that this might be quite a good idea. And then after a while you judge it will get through, so you ask for it to be considered by governing body. So I was probably seen as an extremely ineffective master, but nevertheless the college did well, and it was a happy place, and I think you don't try and change something just because it changes. If it's working well, don't change it too much. So I was very grateful to them for letting me keep on my own lab work, which I did. So when the time came to stop, I still have a lab to go to, and I'm active again in my own field, and that was very generous of Magdalene to do that, I think. So
do they have a president as well?
Yes, they do. The president is the senior fellow and a very important person. The president really, in many respects, the president is probably more powerful really than the master. The president he's sort of head of the governor of the fellowship. Maybe the same for you, I don't know whether that's...
No, there's a vice provost, but it's not quite the same.
President is a very important position, and I mean, in many ways you're told you are really a servant of the... It is clear, you're a servant of the governing body, and the head of the governing body, in effect, is really the president, though you chair the meetings, but it's a wise manoeuvre, in my view, to go along with that situation. It makes for a happier college.
I mean, colleges are often criticised and equally often supported as a teaching institution and as a place to encourage research. What is your feeling, I mean, about their value?
Yes, well, of course the teaching must be done, and it should be done well, but I personally took the view that we were very keen on every fellow having a significant research contribution. And it worried me a great deal to see some of the younger fellows being asked to do terrible jobs like tutor for admissions. And in my time we sort of survived without having to damage the careers of younger fellows, and now they've rather wisely split it a bit, so it's a little bit spread out. But it is a problem, I think, as to how you get these very tiresome jobs done without damaging the careers of younger people. So my view was we would like all of the fellows to have an important and successful research career, and if they can save time by handing on micro-administration to someone else, I would strongly encourage that.
Who do they hand it on to?
Well, they have secretaries, so that the admissions tutor will have a secretary. Now, a good secretary should take care of, in my view, of all of the mundane stuff. And you need the fellow to take views on principles and explain the principle to the secretary type person or someone who would put it in practice. And I think there are colleges where the fellow concerned is expected to be much more the cold face, doing things themselves. I see the teaching as something which is very important, but I still think it's, for a university like Cambridge, we're trying to compete with the rest of the world, we have to have people who are preeminent in their field. And people at Harvard don't spend their time, a good example, some of my colleagues here spend time marking first-year exam papers. What is ATP or something like that?
And I'm chairman of Part 1 examiners next year.
Well, there you are. That's a big job. Well, I think someone who's got a sizable research group and competing all the time for grant money, and maybe 15 people in its research group going around the world lecturing, should not be asked to mark first-year exam papers. I mean, I think someone else could do that, in my view. Now, this, of course, many people disagree, but you ask what I think, and that is actually what I think.
I'll mention that to my department, quote you at them. Tell me about your current research. You've got this very big institute. We're always being told that we're on the verge of a breakthrough in cancer research and other things.
Yes, so this institute has always been 1/3 cancer and 2/3 what we call developmental biology. Developmental biology means how an egg develops into an animal, normal processes. Cancer is the opposite. When it ceases to become normal, it goes the wrong way.
Yeah.
We've mixed the two. Historically, that's how we got our money, and it still works that way. So cancer, as you know, no one's going to solve cancer overnight. It's inconceivable. It's multiple different disorders, and it can only be analysed by taking each particular cancerous condition and analysing step by step what goes wrong. And we're fortunate in having some very good groups in this institute who are working in aspects of cancer. And they're highly regarded. I mean, I'm very delighted to say that in the last 2 years, each year, we've had one of our, what we call homebred staff members elected to the Royal Society. So these are people who joined us as a kind of senior postdoc, have developed their groups and now are FRS, and that's very, very satisfactory to see people thriving that well. One in the cancer side and the other one in the welcome side, the development biology side. So that's I would rather hope that we would take the view in a place like this that is the career route we would ideally see for our appointments.
Is Michael Bate someone you know?
Yes, he's been a long-standing member of zoology.
He's a developmental biologist.
Yes, that's right. He's chosen to stay in zoology for good reason. Very clever person.
I've interviewed him as well.
Did you?
Yes.
Very successful.
Very nice man too.
Yes.
Just returning to that question, I mean, either the 2/3 or the 1/3, what would you pick out as the most exciting thing that is going on in this laboratory?
In this institute?
Yes, in this institute.
Let me answer that by quoting the two people I've mentioned. One of them was elected Royal Society this year, called Stephen Jackson, appointed professor very young, and he's made real inroads into DNA repair. That all the time our genes are being damaged, and these are major causes of cancer, and he's been analysing meticulously, step by step, what goes wrong, with a view to trying to see if one can eventually alleviate the process of DNA damage by various chemicals which have favourable effects. And he started a company called Kudos, which saw the commercial side of this, and that was when he was a young person running a group. He also started his company. Now that was then sold for some huge sum of money recently, which I'm delighted to say. But when I was chairman here, I actually strongly encouraged this commercial side of things, because otherwise they're not well paid, these people, and I don't think if we said we don't want any commercial stuff going on, they'd have stayed, we'd have lost them all. So by encouraging the applied or commercial side of the work that goes on, I strongly believe that's what we should be doing. It's good for everything, for the country, the economy, for the individual, and for the university. So he's been very successful there. And another very successful younger person called Daniel St. Johnson, who works on the other side. He's on the developmental biology side, and he's analysing how it is that the components of an egg, in this case an insect egg, arise, because they form the basis of how the whole of the development occurs, how the whole of life progresses from there onwards. Egg is a kind of template, really, for the rest of life. Everything starts that way. And the very key question is, how does this amazing cell come to be possessed with these components in a way that enables it to start the next life? And he's been analysing that very successfully. So those are two good examples of younger people who've thrived happily in this environment and making very highly known internationally and made great success in their careers. So I would give you those two examples of people who I think are doing preeminently interesting work.
It was interesting you touched on the links with the applications, the practical applications. Are these science park companies? I mean,
yes, the way it works is that if someone, Stephen Jackson and another one called Tony Kuzarides, both started companies.
How do you spell his name? Tony?
Kuzarides.
Kuzarides.
Another group leader, senior group leader on the cancer side. And they both, the rules we have to operate, because we are charity funded, is that you can't do commercial work in a charitable organisation. So they have to have their company in the science park or somewhere separate. And they go across and act as a kind of advisor or guider. They guide the activity of that. Both places, both people have now sold their companies very successfully. Tony's one has he really sponsored a company called Abcam, which is very successful in making antibodies. A good Cambridge company that emerged out of someone from his group. That he could see the commercial side of it, and but it has to be kept separate from from us as a charity. Otherwise, we would lose our charitable status. But that works fine. No reason why you couldn't have a separate, as they do, separate groups, often quite large, working commercially, but not in this actual building. And it's good for the group leader, I would say, too, because they have benefit from it materially and in a way scientifically too.
Some of the people I've talked to, like Andy Hopper, and I'm going to be interviewing Herman Hauser, not those two in particular, have expressed a concern that the relations between these startup companies and the university is always a very difficult one, because it's tempting for a university, particularly if it feels that it must raise more endowment and cash income to free it, to start putting too many bureaucratic hurdles and too much pressure on science innovations. Have you come across this problem at all?
Well, I have to say I perhaps haven't, but then Andy Hopper would know much more about that than me, and as indeed with Stephen Jackson and Tony Kuzarides. But both of these two have done extremely well. There may have been, I'm sure it's not entirely plain sailing when you're trying to balance these two things, but it must be the way surely forward for academics in university to have a significant commercial interest if possible. Government would want this. It's good for the country because you develop business and you give employment to people. And so it surely must be exactly the right thing to do, and hope that the university doesn't prevent it happening, as they happened in these cases. I mean, we are. You never know when you have a clever idea, if you ever do have one, whether it happened when you're at work or when you're sitting at home. But it's pointless to try and guess. But the fact is, these two have both been very successful and works well, and the university has certainly not interfered with it to an extent that has been at all damaging. So from my perspective, it's a very good way of doing things.
Well, there are many, many other things I'd love to have talked to you about, but I think that your lift is going to be coming quite soon. Is there just one other thing that, or anything else that I really should have asked you that you can...
Well, thank you. You've asked a very clever set of questions that touches on almost everything. I suppose one would particularly like to have made sure that I mention the people who've been instrumental in giving me what has really been an amazingly fortuitous career, ending up with in this nice new institute, contributing, I think, to the colleges, universities and everything. And I particularly mentioned Gabriel Horn, who I have mentioned. I would like to mention Ron Lasky, who was crucial in getting this whole institute going. He's now is a professor at the university, but he works in another institute up in the hospital. I think particularly those two I would want to mention as being particularly supportive for not just for me, but really for the whole university, of which they've been members all that time. And of course, a great gratitude to Magdalene College and Churchill College, who have been extremely good to one. As I say, one feels a bit parasitic if one can contribute. I'm really privileged to have been have a career in a place like Cambridge, and of course Max Perutz for bringing me here.
Well, it's lovely to end like that. So thank you very much indeed, John.
Thank you very much for interviewing me.